The first thing I saw that morning wasn't the lake. It was a sheriff's cruiser parked beside the entrance to my shoreline, with its emergency lights flashing across the water, while a bright blue ribbon stretched between two brand-new marina posts like somebody was about to celebrate something that had never belonged to them. Residents gathered along the dock holding coffee cups and phones, smiling as if they had front-row seats to a victory. Right in the middle of them stood Vanessa Holloway, president of the Harbor Crest HOA, wearing a crisp white blazer and expensive sunglasses despite the cool morning fog rolling over the lake. She raised a leather folder high enough for everyone to see. "By authority of the Harbor Crest Homeowners Association," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the quiet shoreline. "This private waterfront is now restricted to HOA members only. Remove him from the property." Big mistake. I didn't argue. After enough years owning land, you learn that loud people usually arrive before the paperwork does. I simply stood near the old cedar dock my father built nearly 40 years earlier, hands resting in my jacket pockets while gentle waves tapped against the pilings behind me. A deputy glanced toward me, then toward the sheriff standing beside the patrol vehicle. Neither one moved. That silence caught my attention immediately. Vanessa mistook it for hesitation. She smiled wider and pointed toward a polished stone monument with Harbor Crest Marina carved into the front. Behind it, dozens of boats floated quietly in slips filled only a week earlier. Families wandered along the boardwalk laughing, completely unaware that every single dock behind them depended on something far less impressive than the luxury clubhouse, the security gate, or the expensive boats rocking gently in the morning breeze. It depended on paperwork. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound confident instead of angry. "You were warned several times," she said. "This shoreline is now managed by the HOA. You have no right to interfere with today's grand opening." Managed. Funny word. People like Vanessa loved words that sounded official. They often confused management with ownership. They weren't the same thing. The sheriff finally walked toward us holding a thin county file beneath his arm. He looked from Vanessa to me without saying a word. Behind him, a county attorney had just stepped out of another vehicle carrying a survey tube almost as long as her arm. That was interesting. Survey tubes rarely appeared at ribbon cuttings unless somebody expected a disagreement. Vanessa noticed them too, but her smile never faded. She believed every document she needed was already inside the folder she carried against her side. She had no idea one missing legal detail could decide the future of the entire marina. And standing there beside the shoreline my family had protected for generations, watching hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of boats drifting peacefully behind her celebration, I realized something important. Vanessa Holloway still thought she was standing on HOA property. Nobody applauded when the sheriff stopped a few feet away from us. They simply watched, waiting for someone in uniform to confirm what Vanessa had already declared. Around here, people tend to believe the first person holding a folder. Vanessa knew that. She squared her shoulders and handed the sheriff her paperwork with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. "Everything has already been reviewed by our legal committee," she said. "The HOA board voted unanimously. The shoreline now falls under community marina operations, and Mr. Carter has been instructed to leave immediately." The sheriff accepted the folder without comment and began turning the pages one at a time. He wasn't reading quickly. Experienced lawmen rarely do. They understand that important mistakes usually hide inside ordinary documents. Vanessa folded her arms and looked toward the growing crowd as though the matter had already been settled. "I tried being reasonable," she announced loudly enough for several homeowners standing near the clubhouse to hear. Unfortunately, some people refused to cooperate with progress. A few residents nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Most simply wanted the ribbon-cutting ceremony to continue. A catering company had already arranged breakfast tables beneath white tents overlooking the marina. Fresh coffee filled the cool morning air, while a local photographer adjusted his camera near the entrance sign. Everything looked perfectly organized. Everything except the conversation happening beside the dock. I remained exactly where I was. My lawyer had given me one piece of advice years earlier that had never failed me. Never interrupt someone who is confidently making your case for you. Vanessa interpreted my silence as surrender. "Sheriff," she continued, "our security team has documented repeated interference with HOA property. If necessary, We'd like him formally removed before guests begin boarding the boats. The deputy standing a few yards behind the sheriff shifted his weight, but said nothing. His eyes drifted toward the county attorney, who had quietly removed several rolled survey maps from the tube she carried. She didn't unroll them. Not yet. She simply held them beneath her arm while listening to every word Vanessa spoke. That caught my attention more than anything else. Lawyers usually ask questions. This one hadn't asked a single thing. Vanessa noticed none of it. She pointed toward the floating docks stretching across the calm lake. The marina represents millions of dollars in investment, she said proudly. This community finally has the waterfront it deserves. I looked beyond the boats instead, toward the narrow strip of shoreline hidden behind the new retaining wall. Most people saw decorative stone, polished walkways, and expensive landscaping. I saw the same piece of ground my grandfather had walked decades before luxury homes appeared along the lake. Ownership has a way of surviving trends. The sheriff finally closed the folder and looked up. His expression hadn't changed. Neither had mine. But for the first time that morning, I noticed the county attorney glance toward the old cedar dock behind me before quietly asking the deputy for one specific survey reference number. Vanessa kept smiling. She thought they were confirming her authority. I had a feeling they were looking for something else entirely. The deputy repeated the survey reference number slowly, almost as if he wanted to hear how it sounded before anyone else answered. The county attorney looked down at her notes, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned toward the sheriff and quietly asked, "Do we have the original plat on file?" That simple question changed the atmosphere around the marina far more than anyone seemed to notice. Vanessa certainly didn't. She laughed lightly and adjusted the gold name badge pinned to her blazer. "This really isn't necessary," she said. "The county has already seen everything that matters." Confidence can be a dangerous thing when it arrives before verification. The sheriff looked at her for a moment, then handed the folder back without offering an opinion. "We're just making sure the records match," he replied. "Nothing more, nothing less." Vanessa nodded as though that answer supported her position. She turned toward the crowd gathered near the ribbon and raised both hands. "Folks, we'll have everyone on the water in just a few minutes," she announced. "Just one last procedural review." A few people clapped politely. Children pointed toward the boats tied neatly along the floating docks, while a local television cameraman adjusted his tripod near the entrance. The marina looked exactly like the kind of place developers loved putting in brochures. Fresh timber, new railings, decorative lights, expensive slips, everything carefully designed to suggest permanence. I looked beyond all of it, toward the narrow strip of shoreline hidden beneath the retaining wall. Most people never notice the ground underneath expensive projects. They notice what sits on top of it. My grandfather used to say that's why surveyors stay employed. The county attorney finally unrolled one of the maps across the hood of the sheriff's SUV. The deputy leaned closer while tracing several property lines with one finger. Neither of them said a word. Vanessa stepped toward them confidently. "You'll see the HOA boundary highlighted in blue," she said. "That's the area under our authority." The attorney didn't answer. Her finger stopped on a thin line running along the shoreline before continuing toward the marina entrance. She studied it for another few seconds, then quietly folded that section beneath another page so nobody else could see it. That movement lasted less than 2 seconds. I noticed it. So did the deputy. Vanessa didn't. She had already started greeting residents arriving for the ceremony, shaking hands and thanking them for supporting what she proudly called the future of Harbor Crest. Nearby, the event coordinator signaled the caterers to prepare breakfast while the photographer positioned families beside the ribbon. Everything continued as though the opening ceremony were only minutes away. Then the county attorney looked back toward the sheriff and spoke softly enough that only a handful of us could hear. "I'd like to verify one more recorded document before this goes any further." Vanessa smiled without hesitation. "Of course," she replied. "You'll find everything is exactly as we've represented it." I almost smiled myself. Because if there was one thing years of owning waterfront property had taught me, it was this. Sometimes the smallest recorded document carries the biggest consequences. And judging by the way the county attorney had quietly covered one section of that map, I was beginning to suspect she had just found the first piece of a much larger problem. The county attorney rolled the survey back into its tube without explaining what she had seen. That was the part most people misunderstood. Experienced attorneys rarely announce a problem the moment they find one. They verify it first. Vanessa watched the tube disappear beneath the attorney's arm and smiled, as though another obstacle had just been cleared away. "I'm glad we're being thorough," she said brightly. "Once this review is finished, Harbor Crest Marina can finally open the way we always planned." The residents surrounding the dock nodded in agreement. Some had lived there only a few months. Others had purchased homes because the brochures promised exclusive waterfront access. None of them had any reason to question what they had been told. Why would they? Expensive developments have a way of making confidence look like proof. I stayed where I was beside the old cedar dock, listening to the gentle sound of water against the pilings. The lake hadn't changed. It didn't care about ribbon cuttings, HOA meetings, or polished speeches. It had looked almost exactly the same when my grandfather first tied his fishing boat here decades earlier. Property has a strange way of outlasting the people who argue over it. Vanessa walked toward me again, lowering her voice just enough to keep the conversation between the two of us. "You could have avoided all of this," she said. "If you'd simply accepted that the shoreline serves the entire community now, none of today would be necessary." I looked past her toward the marina entrance instead of answering immediately. "Communities are important," I finally said. "But ownership doesn't disappear because more people want something." She gave a patient smile, the kind people use when they believe they're explaining something obvious to a child. "Ownership isn't the issue anymore," she replied. "Access is." That sentence stayed with me long after she walked away. Access. People often think land disputes are about who owns the property. Most of the time they aren't. They're about who controls the right to use it. There's a difference, and that difference has settled more courtroom arguments than loud voices ever will. The sheriff spoke quietly with the county attorney near the patrol vehicle while the deputy radioed someone at the county records office. None of them appeared rushed. That alone told me everything I needed to know. If this had been a simple trespassing complaint, I would probably have been gone already. Instead, nobody had asked me to leave. Nobody had crossed the dock. Nobody had even touched the ribbon waiting to be cut. They were waiting for something. Vanessa mistook that patience for routine government paperwork. She waved toward the event coordinator, who signaled the small band preparing to play during the ceremony. Folding chairs filled steadily with homeowners dressed in polo shirts, sundresses, and boating shoes. Children pointed excitedly toward the lake, while volunteers stacked welcome packets beside the registration table. Every passing minute made the celebration look more expensive. Every passing minute also made the consequences of a mistake much larger. I had no intention of stopping the ceremony myself. That wasn't my job. My job was much simpler. Years ago, someone much wiser than me taught me never to interrupt a person who was confidently building a problem they didn't yet understand. And standing there beside the shoreline that morning, I had the unmistakable feeling Harbor Crest wasn't preparing to celebrate a marina. It was preparing to discover exactly what one overlooked legal document could do. While the county officials quietly compared records beside the patrol vehicles, my mind drifted somewhere the marina could never reach. Long before Harbor Crest had a stone entrance, before luxury homes overlooked the water, before anyone talked about waterfront property values, this shoreline belonged to my family because they worked it, protected it, and refused to sell it when nearly everyone else did. My grandfather, Thomas Carter, bought these 43 acres in 1971 after returning from 3 decades of commercial fishing on the Great Lakes. He wasn't a wealthy man. He simply believed that land beside clean water was something you held on to, even when people laughed at you for it. The shoreline wasn't beautiful because someone landscaped it. It was beautiful because nature had been left alone. My father continued that philosophy. Every Saturday morning, before the sun climbed over the eastern ridge, we'd walk this same stretch of shoreline together carrying old tackle boxes and thermoses full of coffee. He knew every rock beneath the shallow water, every patch of reeds where bass gathered in early spring, every cedar tree leaning toward the lake after decades of winter storms. When I was 12, we built the dock together using rough-cut cedar hauled from a local mill 15 miles away. It wasn't perfect. One corner still settled slightly every spring after the ice melted. My father always laughed when neighbors offered to replace it with something newer. "Strong lasts longer than fancy," he'd say while tightening another weathered bolt beneath the deck. He turned out to be right. That old dock survived storms that destroyed newer ones twice. its size. Years later, after my father passed away, I couldn't bring myself to change much of anything. Every loose board reminded me of afternoons spent sanding lumber beside him. Every faded piling carried marks from boats we'd tied there over 4 decades. Then came Emily. She loved this shoreline almost as much as the men who built it. On quiet evenings, we'd sit at the end of the dock, watching the sun disappear behind the trees while loons called across the lake. After she lost her battle with cancer, those evenings became memories I visited instead of places I shared. Some people leave after grief. I stayed. The shoreline gave me something cities never could. Silence. Real silence. The kind that slowly puts broken pieces of your life back together without asking questions. That's why I never saw this property as an investment. It wasn't a balance sheet. It wasn't future development. It wasn't a marina waiting to happen. It was the last place where 3 generations of my family still seemed to exist at the same time. My grandfather's footprints had disappeared years ago, but the ground remembered them. My father's dock still reached into the water exactly where he wanted it. Emily's favorite cedar bench still overlooked the western cove, where autumn leaves turned the lake copper every October. Most people driving past Harbor Crest saw premium waterfront real estate. I saw birthdays, family dinners, fishing trips, quiet conversations, and promises that had survived far longer than any homeowners association ever would. That was exactly why Vanessa Holloway misunderstood me from the very beginning. She believed she was negotiating over shoreline access. She never realized she had challenged something that couldn't be measured in property values, marina memberships, or board resolutions. And people who mistake family legacy for empty real estate almost always make the same mistake before they discover just how expensive that misunderstanding can become. People sometimes assume a shoreline is valuable because of what you can build on it. Boat docks, vacation homes, marinas, expensive patios overlooking the water. That's how developers usually see it. They measure shoreline in frontage, resale value, and investment potential. My family measured it differently. We measured it in mornings. Every season carried its own rhythm here. Spring smelled like wet cedar and fresh earth after weeks of melting snow. Summer mornings belonged to fishermen launching aluminum boats before sunrise. Autumn painted the far shoreline with colors no photograph ever captured correctly. Even winter had its place. Ice covered the lake so smoothly some mornings that the entire shoreline reflected the sky like polished glass. I learned those seasons before I learned property law. Long before I ever understood deeds or county records, I understood respect. My father never let me leave trash near the dock. He insisted every loose board be replaced before someone could trip. Fallen trees weren't cleared unless they threatened the shoreline itself because he believed wildlife deserved a home just as much as people did. We don't own the lake, he used to tell me. We simply take care of the part we've been trusted with. That sentence stayed with me my entire life. Even after Harbor Crest appeared across the cove with its stone entrance, decorative fountains, and rows of identical mailboxes, I never changed the way I cared for this property. The old cedar dock stayed exactly where it had always been. The walking trail remained narrow enough that deer still crossed it most evenings. I refused offers from contractors who promised to modernize everything with steel railings and composite decking. Newer isn't always better. Sometimes history deserves to stay visible. After Emily passed away, that shoreline became something even more important. Every Sunday morning, I carried a cup of black coffee down to the bench overlooking the western cove and sat quietly while the lake woke around me. Loons drifted across the calm water. Turtles climbed onto the same fallen log every April. Eagles circled above the pines searching for fish. Nobody interrupted those mornings. Nobody hurried them. Grief has a strange way of changing what matters. Things that once seemed ordinary become priceless because they're the last places where memories still feel close enough to touch. That's why I never cared when nearby property values doubled. I never cared when neighbors sold to developers for numbers that sounded impressive on paper. Money can replace a house. It can't replace 40 years of mornings. Vanessa Holloway never understood that difference because she arrived after everything meaningful had already happened. To her, this shoreline represented opportunity. It completed the marina. It increased homeowner value. It gave Harbor Crest exclusive waterfront access that competing developments didn't have. Every board meeting she held focused on numbers, amenities, memberships, and future expansion. Every conversation I had about this shoreline centered on responsibility. Those two ways of thinking were never going to meet in the middle. Looking back now, I realized the disagreement between us was never truly about the dock, the marina, or even the shoreline itself. It was about what people believe property actually means. Some see ownership as permission to control. Others see ownership as a promise to protect. My family had lived by that promise for generations. Harbor Crest had mistaken that promise for weakness. Standing beside the lake that morning, while music drifted from the opening ceremony and county officials quietly continued reviewing documents near the patrol vehicles, I found myself wondering whether Vanessa had ever cared enough about any place to understand why someone would refuse to sell it at any price. A few minutes later, I would begin to suspect that question mattered far more than either of us realized. Looking back, the warning signs didn't begin with the ribbon, the sheriff, or Vanessa Holloway standing on my shoreline pretending she owned it. They started almost a year earlier with something so ordinary most people would have ignored it. One quiet Tuesday morning in early spring, I was repairing a loose plank near the end of my father's dock when I noticed two men in reflective safety vests standing farther down the shoreline carrying survey poles. At first I assumed they were working for the county. Utility crews passed through the area from time to time, and nobody thought much about it. One of them nodded politely when I looked over. The other studied a tablet before driving a small orange stake into the ground just beyond my property fence. Nothing about the moment felt urgent, but something about it stayed with me. 2 days later, I found another stake. Then another. They weren't random anymore. They formed a straight line leading toward the vacant land across the cove where Harbor Crest would eventually be built. A week after that, pickup trucks started appearing before sunrise. Engineers, contractors, environmental consultants. Every few mornings there seemed to be another group taking photographs or measuring elevations along the shoreline. They never crossed onto my property. Not then. They remained careful, professional, respectful. I remember mentioning it to Earl Jenkins, who owned the bait shop 12 miles down the highway. Earl had spent 40 years listening to conversations most people assumed nobody else heard. He poured another cup of coffee and simply said, "Developers always measure more land than they buy." At the time, I laughed. Looking back, maybe I shouldn't have. Construction officially began that summer. Trees disappeared first. Then came heavy equipment, fresh asphalt, utility trenches, and dozens of new houses rising where open fields had stood for decades. Harbor Crest grew faster than anyone expected. Every month another section opened. Families moved in. Landscaping appeared almost overnight. Before long, banners advertising luxury waterfront living hung across the entrance. That wording caught my attention because Harbor Crest itself barely touched the lake. Most of its shoreline advantages existed only on promotional drawings. Then one Saturday afternoon I noticed something that didn't belong. A glossy brochure had been left inside my mailbox by mistake. Across the front was a photograph of smiling families standing beside a beautiful marina at sunset. I recognized the shoreline immediately. It wasn't theirs. It was mine. The angle had been carefully chosen so the old cedar dock barely appeared at the edge of the picture, cropped just enough to make it look like part of Harbor Crest's future development. On the next page, bold letters promised exclusive private waterfront access for every homeowner. I read that sentence 3 times before setting the brochure on my kitchen table. It might have been nothing more than ambitious marketing, or it might have been the first time someone publicly claimed something they didn't actually control. I couldn't prove either one yet. But from that day forward, I started paying much closer attention whenever Harbor Crest talked about its marina, because sometimes the first real warning isn't an argument. It's a promise that sounds just a little too confident. The brochure sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I finally picked it up again. Most people would have thrown it away. I couldn't. Something about that photograph bothered me more than the advertising itself. Harbor Crest wasn't simply promising future waterfront access. They were presenting it as though it already existed. That difference mattered. On the following Monday, I drove 25 miles to the county recorder's office, the same brick building where my father had taken me years earlier to teach me an important lesson. If you ever want the truth about land, he used to say, don't ask the neighbors. Ask the records. Not much had changed inside. The same worn tile floors. The same long counter. The same rows of property books now accompanied by computer terminals. A county clerk recognized my last name immediately and smiled. "Back checking the shoreline again, Mr. Carter?" she asked. I smiled back, just making sure the paperwork still says what my grandfather thought it said. She laughed softly and pointed me toward one of the public record stations. I began with Harbor Crest's subdivision plat. Nothing unusual appeared at first. Lot numbers matched the approved development plan. Utility easements looked standard. Drainage corridors were exactly where engineers would normally place them. Then I opened the shoreline exhibits attached to the filing. That's where things became interesting. The marina footprint stopped several feet short of the actual water boundary shown on earlier county surveys. That alone wasn't a problem. Developers often submit conceptual drawings before final approvals, but the operating diagrams attached to the promotional package showed something different. The docks extended farther than the recorded boundary suggested they legally could. I requested the historical survey file next. The clerk disappeared into the archive room and returned carrying a thick folder covered with faded county labels. Inside were survey maps dating back more than 50 years, including one prepared shortly after my grandfather purchased the property. The shoreline matched exactly what I remembered from childhood. Fence lines, iron pins, bearings, distances. Everything remained consistent across decades of revisions. Land usually tells the same story if enough people write it down carefully. The final document I requested was our original deed. My grandfather had kept a certified copy in a fireproof box at home, but I wanted to compare it against the county's recorded version. Every page matched perfectly. The legal description ran precisely along the shoreline before referencing another recorded instrument by book and page number. That reference caught my attention. It wasn't part of the ownership description itself. It pointed toward a separate recorded agreement filed years after the original purchase. I wrote the book and page number onto a notepad before asking the clerk to retrieve that record as well. She looked at the number, paused for just a second, and glanced back toward me. "Interesting request," she said quietly. "Not many people ever asked to see this one." A few minutes later, she returned carrying a much thinner file than I expected. Only a handful of pages rested inside. No photographs, no engineering drawings, just legal language and signatures. I hadn't read a single sentence yet, but something about the way the clerk carefully placed the document on the table made me slow down before opening it. Sometimes the smallest file inside the county archives ends up protecting the largest piece of property. I had a feeling this might be one of those files. The document was far older than Harbor Crest itself. The paper had yellowed around the edges, and the typewriter lettering had faded just enough to remind me it came from a different generation, back when agreements were written carefully because changing them wasn't easy. I read the first page once. Then I read it again more slowly. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't a transfer of ownership. And it certainly wasn't permission for anyone to build a marina wherever they pleased. It described a limited recorded easement connected to shoreline access under very specific conditions. That immediately caught my attention. Easements confuse a lot of people because they sound larger than they really are. Most folks hear the word and assume ownership has changed hands. It hasn't. An easement allows certain uses under certain conditions. Nothing more. Nothing less. I kept reading. The agreement had been created years after my grandfather purchased the property, back when the county wanted to preserve emergency lake access for future maintenance if the shoreline around the cove ever developed. It mentioned utility access, emergency response, limited ingress and egress, routine maintenance. Everything was carefully defined. Every paragraph narrowed the permission instead of expanding it. Whoever drafted the document understood exactly how easily vague language could create expensive misunderstandings decades later. What I didn't find was almost as important as what I did. There wasn't a single sentence granting permanent control of the shoreline to any future homeowners association. No blanket operating authority. No transfer of possession. No language suggesting that recreational businesses, commercial docking, or community management automatically came with the recorded easement. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the county office window toward the courthouse lawn. Outside, people walked past without giving the building a second thought. Most had no idea that arguments worth millions of dollars were often settled inside quiet rooms filled with paper instead of courtrooms filled with speeches. The county clerk returned carrying another folder I hadn't requested. "Thought you might want this too," she said. It contained several permit applications submitted during Harbor Crest's development. I thanked her and began turning the pages carefully. Most of the permits involved utilities, grading, drainage, and environmental approvals. Nothing unusual. Then I reached the marina planning documents. Attached to one application was a site diagram showing boat slips, floating docks, parking areas, and guest access routes leading directly across the same stretch of shoreline described in the older easement file. I studied the drawing for several long moments. The design depended on that narrow corridor far more than I expected. Without it, the marina functioned very differently. Maybe it still functioned. Maybe it didn't. I couldn't say yet. I wasn't interested in making assumptions. Assumptions were exactly how people ended up standing in front of sheriffs holding the wrong paperwork. So I closed the file, copied every reference number onto my notepad, and asked the clerk for one final record. If the answer I suspected was hiding anywhere, it wasn't in the development plans. It would be in the documents that explained who had the legal authority to rely on that easement in the first place. Harbor Crest didn't wait for the county records to answer my questions. They decided to answer them their own way. Less than a week after my visit to the recorder's office, I found a certified envelope leaning against my front door when I returned from town. The return address belonged to a law firm downtown that specialized in homeowners association litigation. Inside was a 12-page demand letter written in polished legal language that sounded far more confident than it actually was. According to the attorney representing Harbor Crest, I had interfered with HOA operations, intimidated contractors, and disrupted the peaceful enjoyment of community property. The letter demanded that I immediately stop entering what it described as the Harbor Crest Marina Shoreline Corridor. It warned that failure to comply could result in civil action, financial damages, and a request for injunctive relief. I read every page twice before placing it neatly back into the envelope. Good lawyers choose their words carefully. Great lawyers choose what they leave out even more carefully. 2 days later, another notice arrived. This one wasn't from the attorney. It came directly from the HOA board. Bold letters across the top announced an official compliance determination. According to the board, I was prohibited from accessing the shoreline adjacent to the marina while the association finalized operational procedures. At the bottom sat Vanessa Holloway's signature beside the signatures of 4 board members who had apparently voted unanimously. They hadn't asked me a single question before reaching their conclusion. That told me everything I needed to know about how the decision had been made. The following Saturday morning, I drove toward the shoreline just after sunrise, not because I intended to argue with anyone, but because routine has a way of revealing changes faster than confrontation ever does. Before I even reached the old cedar dock, I saw something that hadn't been there the evening before. A heavy steel security gate stretched across the gravel access road leading toward my shoreline. Fresh concrete surrounded the new posts. Bright aluminum signs warned that unauthorized entry into Harbor Crest Marina property would be prosecuted. One security guard stood beside the keypad, while another slowly walked the fence line carrying a clipboard. When they saw my truck, both men stepped forward politely. Neither raised his voice. Neither acted disrespectfully. One of them simply handed me another printed notice explaining that access beyond the gate required HOA authorization. I thanked him, folded the paper, and drove away without saying another word. That probably confused them. Vanessa expected anger. She expected shouting. She expected threats. Calm people are difficult to fight because they rarely give you anything to use against them. By Monday afternoon, the complaints started appearing elsewhere. The county planning office received accusations that I was obstructing lawful development. The sheriff's office received reports claiming I had harassed marina employees. Even the environmental department logged a complaint suggesting I had interfered with shoreline maintenance. Every agency responded the same way. They opened a file. They documented the complaint. They asked for supporting records. Paperwork creates patience. Vanessa mistook that patience for progress. During the next HOA meeting, she proudly announced that Harbor Crest had taken decisive action to protect community assets and preserve exclusive waterfront access. Residents applauded. They believed the difficult part was over. What none of them realized was that every letter, every complaint, every locked gate, and every signed notice depended on one legal assumption. And the more documents Harbor Crest produced based on that assumption, the more carefully my attorney told me to save every single one. By the time Harbor Crest finished sending notices, my attorney had organized every letter, complaint, and certified envelope into a single binder nearly 3 inches thick. Clara Bennett had practiced property law for more than 30 years, and she had a habit that reminded me of old surveyors. She never rushed to conclusions. She built them one document at a time. We spread the county records across the conference table in her office late one Thursday afternoon. The original deed rested beside the historical survey. The recorded easement sat underneath the marina development plans. Then Clara reached for a document I hadn't paid much attention to before. "This is the annual operating authorization attached to the marina permit," she said quietly. "Let's slow down and read every line." We did. The first page covered inspection schedules, environmental compliance, and dock maintenance. Nothing unusual. The second page listed emergency access responsibilities. Again, everything appeared routine. Then we reached the final page. Clara placed one finger beneath a single paragraph before sliding the document toward me. "Read this sentence carefully." I did. It explained that continued marina operations depended upon maintaining all recorded property rights, access agreements, and easement authorizations required by county approval. That wording immediately caught my attention. It didn't grant new rights. It assumed the existing rights remained valid and properly authorized. Clara nodded when she saw my expression. "Now compare the signature page." The operating authorization carried signatures from county officials, engineers, environmental inspectors, and Harbor Crest's development manager. Then, beside one required certification, appeared a signature identifying the approving party responsible for the shoreline easement. I stared at the name for several long seconds. It wasn't mine. It wasn't my father's. It wasn't anyone from my family. In fact, it belonged to someone with no recorded ownership interest in our shoreline at all. Clara didn't say anything while I looked back and forth between the authorization and the county records. Finally, she spoke. "I'm not saying someone committed fraud," she said carefully. "There are several ways paperwork like this can end up incorrect." She always chose her words with precision. Lawyers who survive a long time usually do. "But I am saying something important happened here," she continued. "Someone's certified authority they may never have possessed." The room grew very quiet after that. Outside her office window, traffic moved through downtown like any ordinary evening. Inside, the entire dispute suddenly looked different. Up until then, I believed Harbor Crest misunderstood the shoreline. Now I wasn't so sure misunderstanding explained everything. Somebody had relied on a legal authority that the county records weren't showing me. Whether it came from a mistake, an assumption, or something else entirely, I still couldn't prove. Neither could Clara. And that was exactly why she closed every file, looked directly at me, and smiled for the first time all afternoon. "Don't call anyone," she said. "Don't answer another HOA letter. Let them keep believing the paperwork supports them." I asked her why. She tapped the operating authorization once with her pen. "Because if this document means what I think it means," she replied quietly, "they're about to introduce the county to their own biggest problem." Clara told me the hardest part of a property dispute isn't proving you're right. It's waiting until everyone else proves they're wrong first. So that's exactly what we did. We stopped responding to Harbor Crest's letters. We didn't argue with the HOA board. We didn't challenge the security guards. We didn't ask the sheriff to remove the gate. Every notice they mailed went into the same binder. Every complaint they filed was documented. Every public statement Vanessa made was saved with the date beside it. Paper leaves a trail, and people who believe they're untouchable usually leave the longest trails of all. Meanwhile, Clara submitted a formal records request to the county planning department asking for every document associated with the marina's approval, every amendment filed after construction began, and every recorded reference connected to the shoreline access corridor. She wasn't accusing anyone of wrongdoing. She simply wanted complete records. That's much harder to refuse. Within 2 weeks, county officials scheduled an internal review to reconcile several documents that referenced the marina project. Nobody from Harbor Crest seemed concerned. Why would they be? As far as they knew, the marina had already opened, homeowners were paying their association dues, and the grand opening ceremony was only days away. Vanessa even posted a cheerful announcement on the community bulletin celebrating what she called Harbor Crest's newest waterfront tradition. Residents were encouraged to invite family and friends. Local business owners would provide refreshments. A reporter from the county newspaper planned to cover the ribbon cutting. Everything pointed toward a celebration. Clara looked at the announcement, smiled quietly, and slid it into our binder. Perfect timing, she said. The sheriff's office also received a request from the county planning department asking that deputies be present during the ceremony in case questions arose regarding public access and crowd management. That wasn't unusual. Large public gatherings often included deputies. What interested me was who made the request. It hadn't come from Harbor Crest. It came from the county itself. 2 days before the ceremony, Clara received a phone call from the planning director. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. She listened far more than she spoke. When she finally hung up, she simply closed her notebook and looked toward me. "They've finished comparing the recorded documents," she said. I waited for her to continue. She didn't. Instead, she asked one question. "Can you be at the marina by 8 o'clock Friday morning?" I nodded. "Good," she replied. "Bring nothing except your original deed." That answer surprised me. I expected survey maps, binders, photographs, and years of paperwork. Clara shook her head before I could ask. "The county already has everything else." That was the moment I realized the case had quietly shifted out of our hands. We were no longer trying to convince anyone. The records had begun speaking for themselves. On Friday morning, Harbor Crest expected television cameras, applause, and ribbon cutting. The county expected something entirely different. And judging by the calm confidence in Clara's voice, she already knew which one of those expectations was about to become reality. By 8 o'clock Friday morning, Harbor Crest Marina looked exactly the way Vanessa Holloway had imagined it would. White tents lined the boardwalk. Fresh flowers framed the entrance sign. A brass band played softly while homeowners gathered with coffee, cameras, and boating jackets, waiting for the ribbon-cutting ceremony to begin. The local newspaper reporter stood near the registration table while a television crew adjusted its microphones toward the stage where Vanessa smiled confidently behind a polished podium. "Welcome," she announced, "to the future of waterfront living." Then the sheriff's SUV rolled slowly into the parking lot. A second county vehicle followed behind it. The music faded. Conversation stopped. The county planning director stepped out carrying a slim document case. Clara Bennett walked beside him with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the entire dispute. I followed several steps behind, holding only my grandfather's original deed. Vanessa greeted them with complete confidence. "Perfect timing," she said. "We're just about to begin." The planning director nodded politely. "Before you do, we need to resolve several issues involving the recorded property rights supporting this marina." He placed 4 documents on a table where everyone could see them. The first was Harbor Crest's recorded subdivision plat. The second was my family's original deed. The third was the recorded shoreline easement. The fourth was Harbor Crest's approved marina operating permit. Vanessa stepped forward immediately. "Our marina was approved by the county," she said. "Everything was reviewed years ago." "The permit was approved," the planning director replied calmly. "But the permit was approved subject to existing recorded property rights remaining valid." He opened the operating permit to a highlighted paragraph. "This marina was authorized because county records reflected continued legal access through a recorded shoreline easement. Without that recorded easement, this marina could not legally operate in its approved configuration." Several residents leaned forward. The reporter quickly began taking notes. The planning director then placed his finger on the easement itself. "This document grants limited access rights only. Emergency response. Utility maintenance. Limited shoreline maintenance. Nothing in this recorded easement transfers ownership. Nothing grants Harbor Crest operational control. Nothing authorizes commercial marina management. Nothing authorizes the HOA to exclude the property owner from his own shoreline." Vanessa's confident smile disappeared. "But we've been operating the marina," she interrupted. "Operation does not create authority," the planning director answered. "Authority must exist before operation begins." He then lifted my grandfather's deed. Mr. Carter remained the owner of every inch of this shoreline throughout the entire development process. Harbor Crest never acquired ownership. More importantly, Harbor Crest never obtained the legal operational authority required to exercise control over the recorded easement on which its marina approval depended. He paused long enough for every resident to understand the next sentence. "The county has completed its review. Because the marina permit depended upon a recorded easement that granted only limited access rights. and because Harbor Crest never obtained lawful operational authority over that easement, the county cannot recognize the HOA's actions restricting Mr. Carter's access or managing this shoreline as legally valid. Absolute silence spread across the marina. Even the band stopped moving. Then the planning director closed the permit and delivered the sentence that ended the argument. Effective immediately, county authorization supporting marina operations is suspended pending correction of these legal deficiencies. Nobody looked at me anymore. Every eye turned toward Vanessa. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The ribbon hanging across the marina entrance suddenly looked meaningless. It had been prepared for a celebration. Instead, it had become the backdrop for a public legal collapse. The county planning director handed the suspension order to the sheriff. Please assist while county personnel secure the marina under today's administrative order. The sheriff nodded once. Deputies, he said calmly, maintain the peace while the county posts its notices. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. That made the moment even more powerful. Two deputies walked directly to the security gate Harbor Crest had installed to keep me away from my own shoreline. One removed the polished members-only sign. Another unlocked the gate so county inspectors could enter. County employees carefully covered Harbor Crest's grand opening banners with bright administrative notices explaining that marina operations had been suspended pending compliance with recorded property rights, easement limitations, and county permit requirements. Across the parking lot, the brass band quietly packed away its instruments without playing a single note. Caterers stopped serving breakfast. Contractors disconnected power from the temporary stage. One by one, the celebration disappeared. Then the questions began. Does this mean our marina memberships aren't valid? One homeowner asked loudly. Another resident stepped toward the registration table, holding his receipt. I paid almost $6,000 for a premium boat slip. Who approved that? Someone farther back raised a welcome packet. Were we sold access that the HOA never legally controlled? Vanessa tried to answer, but every sentence sounded weaker than the one before. Before she could recover, the local reporter stepped forward. Ms. Holloway, he asked clearly enough for nearby cameras to capture every word. How much money has Harbor Crest collected through marina memberships, annual slip fees, guest passes, and waterfront assessments based on property the HOA did not have legal authority to control? Vanessa froze. She looked toward the board members standing behind her. None of them came to her defense. One quietly removed his board badge and slipped it into his jacket pocket before walking off the stage without saying a word. Another avoided every camera by disappearing into the crowd. The reporter waited. Ms. Holloway. Still nothing. The silence became her answer. Residents who had applauded her less than 30 minutes earlier now surrounded the registration table demanding refunds, explanations, and copies of the original documents. Several pointed toward me. Realizing for the first time that the man they had been told was obstructing progress had never raised his voice once during the entire dispute. Clara stood beside me with her hands folded. The records usually win, she said quietly. They just take longer to speak. A few weeks later, the county's findings were affirmed in court. The judge upheld the county's interpretation of the recorded deed, the limited shoreline easement, and the marina permit conditions. Harbor Crest was ordered to remove every restriction placed against my lawful access, revise its marina operations, and negotiate any future shoreline use through proper legal agreements rather than HOA resolutions. Vanessa resigned before the next board meeting. The board replaced nearly half its leadership within the year. But what people around the lake remembered wasn't the resignation. It was the morning Harbor Crest confidently tried to remove the one man whose recorded property rights were the very foundation that allowed their marina to exist in the first place. They hadn't picked a fight with the wrong neighbor. They had picked a fight with the only property owner whose signature their marina should have had all along. The lake was quiet again by the time autumn arrived. The temporary county notices were gone. The television crews had long since packed up their cameras. Even the conversations at the bait shop slowly drifted toward football, fishing, and the weather instead of Harbor Crest. That's the way small communities usually heal. They don't forget what happened. They simply stop needing to talk about it every day. The shoreline looked almost exactly as it had before the dispute began. My father's cedar dock still stretched into the calm water with its familiar uneven corner that leaned just a little after every winter thaw. The old bench overlooking the western cove remained beneath the cedar trees where Emily and I had spent so many quiet evenings watching the sun disappear behind the hills. Nothing about those places needed to change because they had never belonged to the argument in the first place. They belonged to the people who cared for them. Harbor Crest eventually reopened its marina, but not the way the board had originally imagined. Every operational agreement was rewritten. Every access policy was reviewed by the county. New signs acknowledged the recorded property boundaries instead of pretending they didn't exist. Future shoreline use required proper legal agreements instead of HOA resolutions. It took months of meetings, revised permits, and careful cooperation before the marina welcomed another boat. Ironically, once everyone started respecting the paperwork, the disagreements almost disappeared. Clara liked to joke that property law rarely creates problems. It usually reveals the ones people have been ignoring. She was right. One cool October morning, I carried my coffee down to the dock just before sunrise like I had done for years. Mist floated gently across the lake while a pair of loons drifted near the reeds without paying the slightest attention to property lines or legal documents. An eagle circled high above the shoreline before settling into the same old pine tree where I remembered seeing one with my father decades earlier. Some things change. The important things usually don't. I sat on the bench overlooking the water for a long time that morning, listening to little more than gentle waves touching the cedar pilings. My grandfather used to say land has a longer memory than people. I understand what he meant now. The shoreline remembered every season, every storm, every family gathering, every quiet sunrise, and every promise made beside the water. It remembered my grandfather teaching me how to cast a fishing line. It remembered my father tightening bolts beneath the dock. It remembered Emily smiling across the lake on warm summer evenings. Those memories never appeared in the county records, but they were every bit as real as the deed resting safely inside my desk. Looking back, I don't remember the argument nearly as clearly as I remember the lesson. Ownership isn't measured by how loudly someone claims authority. It isn't created by expensive developments, polished speeches, or unanimous HOA votes. Real ownership is protected by truth, documented with patience, and preserved by people willing to stand quietly until the records speak for themselves. Every time I walk that shoreline now, I think about how close Harbor Crest came to forgetting one simple principle my grandfather understood all along. Land doesn't belong to the person who talks the most. It belongs to the person who can prove it.